There is a particular kind of moment where you do something before your brain has finished deciding whether to do it, and the only way you understand why is by watching what happens after. I said she was my wife at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, in a hospital waiting room in a city neither of us lived in, to a man in a gray suit who was explaining, with the practiced patience of someone who repeats things for a living, that only immediate family could be admitted to see her father. I didn't plan it. I didn't weigh the options. I just looked at her, standing in the middle of that corridor in a coat she'd clearly been wearing since the airport, her face doing something that was trying very hard not to be falling apart, and said the words. The man in the gray suit looked at me. She looked at me. I looked at the man in the gray suit. "If you need ID," I said, "I have it in the car." He nodded and showed us in. "My name is Marcus Webb. I was 34 years old, a long-haul logistics coordinator for a freight company headquartered in Cincinnati, which meant I spent most of my working life making sure things arrived where they were supposed to, when they were supposed to, in the same condition they left in. I was good at the job. I was less good at the kind of problem you can't track on a spreadsheet or reroute when the path closes. I had been traveling for work since the previous morning, a 2-day stretch of connecting flights and rental cars and client meetings across 3 states, which was unremarkable for the job and which usually ended with me in a mid-tier hotel eating something from a bag. This particular trip ended at Mercy Regional in Dayton, Ohio, because I had been sitting next to a woman on the last leg of the flight from Pittsburgh, and she had been white-knuckling the armrest for reasons that had nothing to do with turbulence, and by the time the wheels were down I knew her father had collapsed at work that morning, and she was trying to reach a hospital in a city she didn't know, and her car was at the airport in Columbus and she just couldn't. I'd told her I had a rental, that the hospital was on my way to the hotel. That it was no trouble. It was not on my way to the hotel. She hadn't noticed, or had been too far into the logistics of the day to care about mine. Her name was Claire Alderman. She was 31, a middle school science teacher from Columbus, and she had brown eyes that were red around the edges, from a kind of crying she'd been doing very quietly, and with a great deal of effort since somewhere over western Pennsylvania, hoping I wouldn't notice, while I noticed everything, and pretended very effectively not to. I did not know why I was doing any of this. I knew, in a general sense, she'd needed help, that was sufficient. I had never needed a better reason than that. My father used to say that the most important thing about a person was what they did when they thought no one was keeping score, which was the kind of line that sounds like a fortune cookie until you're the person sitting in a rental car outside a hospital trying to remember which exit you were supposed to take. But there was something more specific than that, which I was not looking at directly yet. She was not the first person I'd sat next to on a plane. I had sat next to hundreds of people on planes. I had not driven any of them to hospitals in unfamiliar cities. There was something about the way she had held herself together, the specific private effort of it, like she considered it her job to keep her fear contained so it wouldn't inconvenience anyone, that had made me want to stay. I had been alone for 2 years. Not unhappily, not bitterly, just alone, in the specific way that becomes so normal you stop noticing it until something contrasts it. My last relationship had ended with a conversation that was careful and honest, and left neither of us villainous, and I had moved into a 1-bedroom near the airport and filled my time with work and running and a standing Tuesday night call with my sister in Portland, and it was fine. It was a perfectly manageable life. I just occasionally had the feeling, in hotel rooms and airports and the quieter parts of long drives, that I was very good at showing up for the logistics of things and was perhaps underinvested in the rest. The hospital waiting room had 47 chairs, a television mounted in the corner running cable news with the sound off, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like a person who had received bad news recently. Claire sat with her hands in her lap and her coat still on and her phone face down on the seat beside her, waiting for the doctor to come out. I sat 2 seats away and said nothing, because she didn't need talking and I had learned the difference. At some point I went to the vending machine down the hall and came back with coffee and a bag of peanut butter crackers, and set them beside her without comment. She looked at them, then at me. "I didn't ask," she said. "I know," I said. "You were going to need them anyway." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read, not quite surprised. Closer to something like recognition. like she'd seen a thing she wasn't expecting to find here. Then she picked up the coffee. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The crackers weren't much. I meant the other thing. A beet. In the corridor. You didn't have to. It was the fastest option." She looked at me again, the same expression. "You do that," she said. "What?" "Say the practical reason. Like that's the whole reason." I didn't say anything. She turned back to the television, which was currently showing footage of a weather system over the Gulf. We sat there in the fluorescent light, and I thought about what she'd said and decided I didn't have a good answer to it, and that was probably information. The doctor came out an hour later. Her father had had a cardiac event. Not a heart attack, technically, but the kind of episode that announces one is coming if no one makes changes. Stable, cautious prognosis, 2 to 3 days of monitoring. Claire listened with her hands still in her lap, asked 3 specific questions that told me she was a person who got information before she let herself react, and thanked the doctor with a composure that had clearly cost her something. He left. She sat down again. And then she put her face in her hands and her shoulders went up once, and she held it there for a moment, and then she put her hands back in her lap and straightened and looked at the middle distance. I didn't say anything. I didn't put a hand on her shoulder. I just stayed in the chair. After a while she said, without looking at me, "You really don't have to be here." "I know," I said. "Most people would have left after the corridor." "I'm not most people," I said. Not as a boast, just as a statement of fact that happened to be true. She looked at me sideways. Something passed across her face. Not quite a smile. Not yet. Something earlier than a smile. The thing that exists just before the face decides. "No," she said. "You're not." I stayed another hour. She called her sister. I gave her the space of the hallway for that. She called her mother. I got more coffee. By the time things had settled into the particular, exhausted calm that follows a crisis that isn't over but is at least known, it was after 7, and the hospital had that nighttime quality. Quieter, less certain, the overhead lights making the linoleum shine in a way that made the place feel like a photograph of itself. "I should get you to a hotel," I said. "You don't have to. The one closest to here has decent reviews," I said. "I looked it up while you were on the phone." She looked at me for a long moment, like a woman who had learned to be careful about accepting things from people, because accepting things meant you owed something, and she was working out whether this was that kind of thing. Then she decided it wasn't. "Okay," she said. The drive was quiet. Not uncomfortably. The quiet of 2 people who had already passed the part where silence is awkward and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. At a red light about 6 blocks from the hospital, she said, looking out the windshield. "Why logistics?" "I like the problem of it," I said. "Getting something from one point to another with as few losses as possible. It sounds boring, but there are a lot of variables." She was quiet for a moment. "You solved my problem today," she said. "Got me from one point to another. With some losses," I said. "With very few," she said. I pulled up in front of the hotel. She unbuckled, reached for her bag, then paused. "Marcus," she said. It was the first time she'd used my name. Something about the way she said it, careful, like she meant to get it right, did something to the air in the car. "I want to give you my number," she said. "Not because I think you need it, because I'd like to know someone like you exists somewhere within reach." I looked at her. There it was. Not a pickup line, not a performance. Just a woman who had had one of the worst days of the year saying, quietly and precisely, that she wanted a connection to the person who had spent it beside her, in the specific way that honesty arrives when people are too tired for anything else. I gave her my phone. She typed it in. She handed it back, got out, said goodnight from the curb and walked into the hotel without looking back, like someone who'd done the brave thing and didn't need the applause for it. I sat in the rental car for a minute after she went in. I had been telling myself all day that this was logistics, that I was simply the person in the right place, that the reason I stayed was because leaving would have been the worse option, and I ran the numbers on options for a living. The thing about numbers is that they tell you what you need to hear when you're willing to read them straight. I texted her that night. 3 sentences. "Just got to the hotel. Let me know how he does tomorrow. You were very steady today, in case no one said so." I set the phone down and waited for the doubt to arrive, the second guessing that usually followed anything I did that wasn't strictly procedural. It didn't come. I fell asleep before 10 and slept until my alarm, which was something I hadn't done in longer than I wanted to admit. She texted back at 7 the next morning. Dad had a good night. They moved him out of monitoring. Thank you for the steady. I did not feel steady. And then, after a pause, the wife thing is going to make a very good story someday. I read that 3 times. Then I typed back, only if it has a good ending. She didn't reply immediately. I checked out of the hotel, turned in the rental, got through security, and was at my gate with 20 minutes to spare when my phone buzzed. I think it might, she said. We talked on the phone for the first time 5 days after that, on a Tuesday, because she had asked when I was usually free and I'd told her Tuesday evenings and she'd called at 7 on the dot, which was a thing I noticed about her. She was precise about time. Not rigid, precise. There's a difference. Rigid is fear of the wrong answer. Precise is respect for the right one. We talked for 2 hours. About her father, who was home and being irritatingly resistant to dietary changes. About the freight system and why it was more philosophically interesting than most people assumed. About the book she was reading, which she described with the same focused, slightly exasperated love she seemed to apply to most things she cared about. About her classroom, the 3rd period class specifically, the one she'd mentioned on the plane when she was trying to think about something other than her father's heart. 12-year-olds who were supposed to be learning about photosynthesis but kept asking her how birds knew where to go in winter. What did you tell them? I said. That no one knows exactly, she said. That scientists have theories, magnetic fields, star patterns, landmarks, but that migration is still, at its core, a mystery. And that the not knowing is not a failure. It's just the honest answer. I thought about that for a moment. You like the honest answer, I said. I teach science, she said. The honest answer is usually the only one worth having. She asked me, somewhere in the 2nd hour, whether I had a good reason for why I'd said what I said at the hospital. I had a practical reason, I said. You already established those are different things. She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh without reservation, without the weight of the day still on her, and it was sudden and genuine and entirely unguarded, and something in my chest that had been doing its job quietly for 2 years noted it and filed it somewhere important. Give me the real reason, she said. I thought about it. I didn't want to be the person who saw the door close and didn't say anything, I said. I don't know, that's the closest I can get to it. She was quiet for a moment. That's a good reason, she said. We didn't talk the following Tuesday. I called at 7 and it went to voicemail, which I told myself meant nothing, and then sat with for most of the evening, which meant it meant something. I sent a short text, hope the week's okay, and got back a single word at 11:30, tired. Which I read about 12 times trying to determine whether tired meant tired or tired meant something else, and which was, I recognized, not a thing I usually did. I usually had a clear picture of what I was dealing with and worked from there. I did not have a clear picture. I was not working from anywhere. She called Thursday. Her voice had that scraped thin quality of someone at the end of something. A parent from school had sent a complaint to the administration about her. She'd given a student's essay a lower grade than the parent believed it deserved, and the parent had escalated in the specific way that people escalate when they have decided the facts are secondary to the outcome they want. It had been handled. It had still cost her 3 days. I'm sorry, I said. You don't have to be sorry, she said. It wasn't your fault. I know, I said. I'm just sorry it happened. She went quiet for a moment. Then, you do that too. What? Say the obvious thing. Like it still needs to be said. A pause. Most people try to fix it. Or they minimize it. You just said the obvious thing. The obvious thing is usually what people actually need, I said. Yes, she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was less agreement than recognition, like someone who had known a truth for a long time and had just heard someone else say it out loud. We talked for another hour. The tiredness went out of her voice, slowly, the way things go when a room warms. By the end, she was telling me about the bird migration question again, a follow-up from a student who had written a whole paragraph in her notebook about what it might feel like to just know where you were supposed to go. Claire had kept it. She said she didn't know why exactly, but it seemed important to keep. We met in Columbus 6 weeks later, a Saturday in early April, her city, a farmer's market near her neighborhood that she'd mentioned offhandedly twice, and which I therefore knew was the right choice. She was already there when I arrived, at a booth with sunflowers and bunched herbs, wearing a dark yellow coat, and when she saw me coming through the crowd, she smiled the way people smile when they've been looking forward to something, and the thing turned out to be exactly as good as they hoped. That got me. We walked the whole market. We had coffee at a place with mismatched chairs and too many plants, which she said had been there for 11 years and which I could see her in, clearly, on ordinary mornings. She told me about her father's slow compliance with the doctor's advice, about a student in her third period class who had been struggling and had written a lab report that had surprised her completely. I told her about a routing problem I'd been working through for 3 weeks that had finally come apart the right way. She asked questions that made me explain things I'd stopped thinking were interesting, and somewhere in the middle of that I realized that I had been interesting to her since the plane, and that I had been slightly too careful to let that land. We had lunch at a Thai place she liked, small and loud in the good way, with plastic menus and a window that looked out onto the street. She ordered without consulting me, which I liked. She knew what was good and assumed I was capable of trusting her on it. The food was excellent. We ate and talked about nothing important for a while, which was the best kind of talking, the kind that doesn't need to go anywhere, because the going itself is the point. At some moment in the middle of it, she said, looking at her plate, "I almost didn't call you." I looked at her. "After you texted that night," she said, "I thought about it for 2 days, whether it was just the situation, whether I was reading something into it that was the day and not you." She picked up her fork, set it down. "I have a tendency to convince myself that good things are contextual, that they're about the circumstances, not the person." "What changed your mind?" I said. She looked up at me. "You texted you were very steady today, in case no one said so. Not let me know if you need anything. Not glad it worked out. You said the thing you actually meant." A slight pause. People who say what they actually mean are rarer than they should be. I thought about that. About my father's line. About what a person does when no one's keeping score. About the specific decision to send those 3 sentences, and not a safer version of them. "I wasn't trying to make an impression," I said. "I know," she said. "That was the impression." We walked back toward her neighborhood in the afternoon. The day had turned warm in that tentative April way, the kind of warmth that isn't sure of itself yet, that you don't fully trust. At the corner 2 blocks from her building, she stopped and turned to face me and said, with no preamble, "I have thought about what you said to the man in the corridor approximately 80 times since it happened." I waited. "Not because it got us in," she said, "because of how fast you said it. You didn't think about it, you just—" She stopped. "I want someone who does that. Not the lie specifically. The thing behind it. The not thinking. The just doing. The I see a door and I say the words." She looked at me steadily. "Don't ever take it back." The afternoon light was on her face. I had spent 2 years being very good at logistics and underinvested in the rest, and here was a woman who had been exactly the same, precise, self-contained, careful with how much she let herself need, telling me that the moment she'd recognized me was the moment I'd stopped calculating and just stepped forward. "I wasn't planning to," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Once, like something had been confirmed that she'd suspected for a while. "Good," she said. "Then come upstairs. My dad wants to meet the man who said his daughter was his wife." I laughed. She laughed. We went upstairs. Her father, who was called Robert and who had strong opinions about coffee and had apparently been following the story of that Tuesday with great interest, shook my hand and said, "So you're the one." I told him I supposed I was. He gave me a look that men give other men when they've already decided about you and just want to see if you know it, and then he poured me a cup of coffee and told me to sit down, and I sat down. 3 months after that, I requested a transfer to the Cincinnati-Columbus corridor. There were more routes than people assumed, and the roads were better than their reputation, and I had found something I wanted to be close to. Not because I couldn't do the long haul anymore. Because proximity, it turned out, was underrated. Claire's father made a full recovery over the spring and has since become an enthusiastic, somewhat too frequent commentator on our relationship, which is a thing I have decided to consider a gift. Claire teaches the same third-period class and still brings home lab reports that surprise her. I still think in logistics, still run the numbers, still find the problem and track it to its source. I just have someone now who notices when the practical reason isn't the whole reason and asks for the rest. That, it turns out, was the variable I had been missing for a long time. What would you have done if someone beside you on a flight was quietly falling apart and the door was closing and you had 2 seconds to decide? And has anyone ever seen through to the thing you were doing before you could explain why you were doing it? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.